The afternoon in Redvale hung heavy, like the final breath of a fading countryside dream. At the end of a dusty road, where even the trees had stopped whispering, stood the auction yard, rust in the air, the clang of old iron pens, and a hoarse voice cutting through it all. The last truck backed into the lot. In the filth and darkness of its rear compartment, a figure was dragged down like abandoned cargo. Ranger, at least that was the name barely legible on the worn leather collar, was a German shepherd, so thin his spine etched a map of survival under the ashen fur. They called him the One Returned. Once, then again. "This one's got seizures," a man's voice croaked, as if talking about a busted washing machine. "Can't serve, can't breed, can't be kept." The crowd murmured. No one looked at Ranger. He didn't whine, didn't growl, didn't resist. Only his eyes, sunken, still, spoke, as if he'd long accepted the truth. No one looks back at what they've already decided to forget. Then came the auctioneer's call. "Starting at $10, whoever wants him, take him." No hands were raised. Until a small figure stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, skinny, a frayed wool cap, an oversized coat brushing her knees. In her hands, she clutched an old tin can plastered with rainbow stickers and silver stars. The soft clink of coins echoed like a sigh from memory. "I'll pay with this," the girl said. "All of it." Heads turned. A few chuckled. Some frowned. The man squinted. "Name?" "Lila Monroe, 10 years old." The silence that followed stretched too long. Then he bent down, opened the can, counted, nodded. Sold. No applause, no smile. Only Lila, walking forward while the world stepped back. She knelt beside Ranger, placing a hand gently on his head. He didn't move. But in that instant, something stirred in his tail. Not a wag. Just enough to say, he knew. Knew someone had come, not to take him, but to hold on to what was barely left. Life. On the way home, Mr. Walter's old pickup turned down a dirt path shaded red. The sun leaned toward the forest, casting a muted amber glow through the glass. Lila sat in the back, her hand resting lightly on Ranger's bony frame. Each bump made her sway, but her hand never left. No one spoke through the 8-mile ride. Only Ranger's strained, staggered breathing filled the space, accompanied by the soft jingle of metal from his collar. At the gate, Lila's mother waited. Her face pale in the dusk, her nurse's scrubs creased and tired. When she saw the dog wrapped in a blanket, she paused, then turned away. "What are you planning to do with that body?" she asked, eyes elsewhere. "It's not a body," Lila answered. "It's Ranger." No reply, just the front door opening. And in that fleeting moment, as mother and daughter passed each other, something old brushed the air between them. A feeling unnamed, like two people who had once lost the same thing, and now it had returned in the shape of a dog. The wooden house tucked behind Redvale's hill held nothing remarkable. White paint peeled from the walls. 3 chairs sat around the dining table. On the wall hung a photo, 4 years old. Lila in the middle, her mother to one side. Her father, dressed in canine uniform, on the other, holding a black German shepherd named Jax. They were all smiling. That was the last time Lila saw her father's real smile. Dylan Monroe died in a special mission in El Paso, leading the search for missing children. They found the girl. They didn't find the way back. The message home came in 4 lines. "Fallen, with honor, unhealable trauma." Jax returned. Less than a year later, Jax passed away from PTSD-induced depression. Since then, Lila hadn't touched a single dog. Until today. That night, she sat alone in the living room, twirling an empty tin can in her lap. It had once held nearly $200, birthday gifts, spare change, forgotten coins on the table, collected over 2 years. She never spent it. Her father once said, "Save for something that matters, something you can't walk away from." And today, that moment came. Not for a toy. Not for a pink bike every kid seemed to have, but for a creature barely clinging on, yet still watching the world. Outside, Ranger lay on an old blanket in the makeshift storage room, the window cracked open for night air. He didn't bark, didn't stir, but he breathed, weak, steady. Lila stepped in, placed a pillow beside him. No words, just sat, close enough to hear his heartbeat, slow but unbroken. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know if Ranger would survive the night. But she knew one thing, something her father had taught her long ago on the training field. You don't need to understand every dog. Just look in their eyes. If they're still waiting, their heart's still fighting. And Ranger's eyes, clouded, tired, had not let go. The next morning, Lila woke before the alarm. No call, no noise. She simply opened her eyes and walked, quiet steps down the hall, toward the storage room. Ranger was still breathing. He lay still, head on the edge of the pillow, ears folded down. But one twitched slightly as the door creaked open. It wasn't full awareness, but it was the first sign he hadn't completely turned from the world. In the kitchen, her mother made coffee in steady motions. Her hands didn't shake, but her gaze wore a misty film. Seeing Lila walk in, she spoke only once. "If you think I'm going to care for that dog, you're mistaken." Lila nodded. No plea, no protest. She grabbed a water bowl and a can of food and returned. She had long grown used to waiting for someone who would never return, so the silence of someone still present no longer cut as deep. That day, the house on the hill seemed to breathe slower. Light filtered through the curtains, sliding across the floor until it touched the edge of Ranger's blanket. He still didn't eat, but his eyes stayed open. He watched, slowly, as if weighing whether this world deserved a return. By noon, Mr. Walter knocked. He didn't say much, just placed a bag on the table. Gloves, vitamin syringes, fish oil. Then he asked, voice low from years of cigarettes, "He's still conscious?" Lila nodded. "Then there's still hope." The old soldier knew well. Survival isn't just about breathing. It's the space between life and living. And sometimes, only the young have the heart wide enough to bridge it. He didn't step into Ranger's room, just stood at the doorway, looked through the crack, and gave a slow nod, the kind one soldier gives another, wings broken but will intact. That night, as Lila's mother locked herself in the bedroom with quiet pills, Mr. Walter sat with Lila in the dim yellow light of the shed. 3 lives in silence. A 10-year-old girl, a dog fighting for every breath, and an old veteran who'd seen too much. "How long you planning to wait for him?" he asked. "As long as it takes," Lila replied, "even if he doesn't get better." "Ranger doesn't have to get better yet. He just needs someone waiting." Mr. Walter smiled. Not joy, just a small curve, like remembering a young man once crouched beside a wounded dog on a battlefield, choosing to stay, even knowing no helicopter would arrive in time. When Lila fell asleep beside Ranger, her hand resting on his side, Mr. Walter stood and quietly stepped out, pulling the door almost closed behind him. Redvale's night settled into a strange hush. Crickets sang, and somewhere beyond the trees, the wind stirred gently, whispering something only dogs can hear. This journey may not have begun with welcome, but it would no longer be walked alone. The next morning, a pale mist blanketed Redvale. Sunlight, dulled behind the gray veil, gave the Monroe kitchen an indistinct glow, neither quite day nor still night. Lila's mother moved like clockwork, brewing coffee in repetitive, mechanical motions. The scent drifted through the room, but it didn't warm the air. On the table, untouched breakfast, toast, a few slices of apple, and an unopened carton of milk. Everything set out by habit, for no one, for nothing. Lila didn't eat. She quietly lifted the bowl of food, mixed by hand, cloth underneath to keep it steady, and made her way toward the storage room where Ranger lay. The wooden door stood ajar, and like every morning, Lila entered barefoot, careful not to make a sound. Ranger was still there, lying in the same position as the night before, head gently resting on the edge of the pillow, eyes half open, as if he'd never truly slept. She placed the bowl down and nudged it closer. "Today's beef porridge is softer," she whispered, like speaking to a friend too tired to reply. "I used fewer carrots. I know you don't like them, but there's fish oil, for your coat." Ranger didn't react. No turn of the head, no twitch of the tail, only his eyes, clouded, dull, remained open, watching. After a while, Lila sat beside him, her head leaning against the rough wooden wall. Her hand rested on the floor just inches away from him, but she didn't reach out. She knew she had to wait. Wait for Ranger to choose. Wait until the will to live could find its own way back to trust. The kitchen clock struck 7. Her mother rinsed out a mug. The faucet dripped in slow, hollow clicks. The house moved in its usual rhythm, enough to function, not enough to feel alive. Ranger's breaths were slow. Each exhale seemed to carry fragments of something lost. Memories of orders once understood, voices once familiar, a life where he was needed. Now, he was just a breathing shadow. Lila pulled a notebook from her sweater pocket. She didn't write, just opened it. The first page showed a drawing of a big dog, ears up, eyes bright, with Ranger scribbled in red crayon beneath it. At the bottom, a single line written carefully the night before. "I don't know if I can fix you, but I know you're not broken." She folded the notebook closed, placing it next to the untouched food bowl. Ranger looked at it. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe it was just light catching his eyes. But there was something still there. Afternoon light slanted through the window, stretching a beam of gold across the cold floor to the tip of Ranger's nose. He didn't move toward it. But for the first time since he came home, he blinked. Lila smiled, not wide, not fast, just a quiet curve, enough to bottle hope in the corner of her heart. And that day, though Ranger didn't eat, didn't bark, didn't stand, Lila still counted it a victory. Because in the dimmest corner of that kitchen, his eyes had opened, just enough to see that someone was still waiting. Night came softly to Redvale. The air wasn't cold, but Lila's room carried a strange emptiness. Light from her bedside lamp fell through faded silver star curtains, casting gentle specks across the bed like lingering fragments of memory. She lay on her side, eyes open, ears straining for any sound from the storage room, where Ranger breathed in fragile rhythm. But there was only silence. Not the kind that frightens. The kind only found in homes that have lost someone and haven't yet adjusted to the idea of something returning. She turned. Her gaze landed on the small wooden cabinet in the corner. The bottom drawer stuck out slightly. Every time the wind came, it would rattle. But tonight, there was no wind. Lila sat up and pulled it open. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. Her fingers were simply used to drifting through the things her father once kept. An old lighter, a worn leash, a military ID cracked at the corner. Beneath faded award papers, she found a dark leather notebook, its spine frayed, the cover chewed as if once held in a dog's mouth. She knew it immediately. Dylan Monroe's training journal, the man who spent his youth studying canine behavior and the final years teaching it to his daughter. She brought the journal to her bed and turned the lamp brighter. Dust lifted like mist. She flipped through pages written in neat blue ink, each line angled with a careful hand. The first entries listed basic commands: sit, stay, heel, come. Then sections for individual dogs: name, behavioral quirks, vocal sensitivities, child interaction. Deeper into the notebook, past yellow tabs, she found a section circled boldly: K9, seizure class, special protocols. Below were tightly packed lines, some smudged by water, rain, maybe, or tears. One phrase was underlined twice. Anchor equals trigger trust. She read it again. And again. Her heart slowed. A scribbled note followed, smaller, as if written in the dark. Anchor was designed as an emotional cue. When a dog disconnects due to trauma or neurological distress, this command acts as a hinge to pull them back to their last safe memory. She closed her eyes. The room fell still. In her mind, Ranger, motionless, his half-lidded eyes, his uneven breath, that awful helplessness as day after day passed and he never reached for the world. Could that be what he was waiting for? Not food, not touch, but a word, a key, still remembered in the deepest part of him. Lila laid her hand on the page. Her heart pounded, not from fear, from something more certain. She closed the book, held it to her chest, and stepped down from her bed. Outside, the path to the shed was covered in mist. Her slippers soaked, but she didn't pause. Inside her, one sentence echoed, clearer than any dream. If this is the last bridge, then I'll cross first. The shed door creaked open, a small sound trying not to disturb the truce they'd held through the nights. The lone bulb overhead didn't brighten the room much, but it was enough. Ranger still lay there, in the same position, head to the side. Eyes half open, as if there was nothing new left to hope for. Lila sat beside him, so gently the floor felt her more than he did. She placed the notebook near her feet, gripped the corner of the blanket beneath the food bowl. Ranger didn't stir. Wind swept through the crack in the rear window, carrying scents of damp grass and night air, the kind of air that keeps old promises. Lila looked at him. Her eyes glistened under the bulb's dim glow. Her voice was quiet but resolute, as if speaking to something buried deeper than exhaustion in him. "Ranger," she said, then paused. A silence stretched between human and dog, a thread searching for signal. She swallowed. Her hand tensed. "Anchor." The word barely rose above the wind. But in that room, it carried the weight of something once real, now rising again. Ranger didn't move for 1, 2, 3 seconds. Then, a small motion at his neck. Subtle, nearly invisible. But Lila saw it. He stirred. She held her breath, eyes locked on him, as if her every heartbeat depended on the next second. Ranger moved again. A paw curled, then stretched. His head tilted. Eyes widened slightly. And then, with a tremble that didn't seem possible, Ranger pushed himself up, forelegs shaking, body trying to obey again. Lila clenched her fists. Tears broke loose. He didn't walk. He dragged, inches at a time, every movement a rebellion against a failing body. But he moved. Once, then again, until his nose reached the bowl. He sniffed. Paused. and, using all he had, he ate. Not much, not fast, but the first bites. Slow, shaky, real. At the doorway, Lila's mother stood, frozen, disbelieving, a glass in one hand, a dish towel clenched in the other. Behind her, Mr. Walter leaned against the frame, his hand on the wood, his eyes on Ranger, eyes of a man who had seen much, but never anything this gentle. No one spoke. 3 people and 1 dog stood in the stillness, holding on to a moment newly returned. When Ranger finished, he looked at Lila. No bark, no wag, just a gaze. But this time it wasn't empty. It held something like gratitude and trust. Lila reached out. Ranger bowed his head, just slightly, as if a trained dog still remembering how to say, "I'm here. I'm ready to try again." That night, Redvale remained quiet. But something had shifted in that small house on the edge of town, where a little girl didn't ask for miracles. Just one word. To call life home. The next morning, the sky draped itself in a silk-like mist. The first rays of sun fell slowly across the front steps, where Lila sat, eyes gazing out at the small yard, her hand still holding her father's training journal. She wasn't waiting for a miracle. She was following traces, as if Ranger's eyes the night before had opened an old door in a house layered with time and silence. Ranger lay nearby, his head resting on an old towel. His body remained frail, but his eyes had cleared. Every time his gaze met Lila's, something subtle passed between them. Like 2 beings who had both been left behind were relearning how to trust together. By mid-morning, Mr. Walter arrived. In one hand, he carried a steaming cup of coffee. In the other, a tin box filled with old military files. Lila's mother gave him a glance and slipped back inside, leaving the 2 of them on the weathered porch. Lila said nothing. She opened the journal. Mr. Walter's finger stopped on a line, underlined twice. Anchor equals trigger trust. A faint smile passed his lips. Not of joy, but of remembrance. The kind of smile that belongs to someone who recognizes something that never should have been forgotten. "Do you know what that word means?" he asked, his voice softer than the breeze. Lila shook her head. "I just saw Ranger eat when I said it." He nodded, placing the tin box on the table, opening the lid. Inside were red stamped documents, faded photographs, and a yellowed handwritten letter signed Dylan Monroe. "Your father wasn't just a canine handler," Walter said, eyes still on Ranger. "He helped pioneer the behavioral seizure detection program for school settings." Lila's eyes widened. He pulled out a slim file, flipped through pages, pointing to an image of a German shepherd lying next to a child with EEG sensors attached. "Recognize him?" She nodded. "Ranger." "Yes. Ranger wasn't just a service dog. He was first-generation Canine Sentinel class, trained to detect dysregulation in children with depression, autism, or trauma histories." He paused, then looked at Lila with weighted intensity. "But the program was shut down. Ranger was flagged for a false alert. He signaled a student who showed no outward symptoms." "What if Ranger was right?" Lila whispered. Walter fell silent. His grip tightened on the paper. The boy was a senator's son. Everything got buried. Ranger, like all evidence, was dismissed, filed as unsuitable. He never got a second chance. Lila turned toward Ranger. The dog lay still, but his ear twitched at her voice. She leaned down, resting a hand on his forehead. "You weren't broken. You were abandoned." Ranger closed his eyes, as if those words were what he'd waited all this time to hear. A breeze swept the yard, stirring dry leaves and carrying the scent of a morning not yet named. But in one quiet corner of Redvale, where a girl sat beside a discarded dog, something returned. Not memory, exactly. Recognition. And sometimes that's all it takes, for life to begin again. Walter sat still on the porch. His coffee had gone cold. Lila's fingers traced each line in her father's journal, like she was retracing the path of someone not yet ready to be lost. Ranger lay by her feet, his breathing steadier, but his eyes fixed on the old man who remained silent for a long time. Then Walter spoke, slowly, huskily, as if dragging something long unspoken to the surface. Ranger was stationed at a high school in Ohio. First trial of the Canines Sentinel program. His role wasn't to protect, it was to sense. Catch what cameras and teachers miss. Lila nodded, lips pressed tight. She didn't interrupt. In week 4, he began reacting to a student. No growls, no barking, just positioning himself in front of the boy every time he entered class. One day, Ranger blocked the door, ears high, breathing rapid, like he was staring at a ticking bomb. The wind stirred the papers. One flipped over, revealing a bold heading. Incident report. Alert behavior detected. Unit R3. That boy was the son of a federal senator, model student, well-mannered, powerful family. No one believed Ranger had a reason. They said it was a sensor glitch, behavioral error. Lila whispered, barely audible. And they labeled him a failure? Walter didn't reply right away. His hand trembled as he retrieved a photo, grainy, from a school camera. It showed Ranger standing guard before a teenage boy. On Ranger's neck, a bright orange service harness reserved for advanced sensory units. 2 weeks later, the program was suspended, all data recalled. Ranger was decommissioned, no testing, no review, just one line in the file. Unstable detection pattern, potential legal risk. Lila clenched her fists. Her eyes reddened but didn't spill tears. Ranger lifted his head, gently licked her knee. It wasn't forceful, but it was the first gesture since coming home that said he was ready to stand with someone, if that someone stood with him. "Everyone thought you were wrong," she whispered. "But what if wrong wasn't wrong?" Walter looked at her, a look from someone who had carried a wound too long, now hearing it named aloud. No one pursued it, but a year later, that same school had an incident. That same boy brought a weapon. No injuries. Security intercepted in time. But if they'd listened to Ranger that day... The air thickened. Lila looked at Ranger, no longer as a child sees a pet, but as one soul recognizing another who had been judged unjustly. "I won't let them write you off as defective, not again." And in that moment, for the first time since the auction, Ranger stood. Not quickly, not steadily, but he rose, on all fours, with nothing but his own will. No one clapped, no one spoke, but both girl and dog understood. Someone had been vindicated, and someone else had chosen to stay. That afternoon crawled slowly. The last rays clung to the window frame like threads tying 2 moments. Before and after the truth found voice. Lila sat at the old table, now a makeshift archive Walter had helped convert. Dozens of documents, reports, certifications lay across its surface. Ranger rested at her feet, eyes closed, ears twitching whenever she turned a page. In her hands was a browned photocopy, its edges singed. A faded, confidential stamp rested in the corner. In the center, 3 sharp lines. Unit, K9R3, status, decommissioned note, unreliable, false alert, risk of political breach. Lila stared at the word, unreliable, as if demanding the world to answer. What do you call someone who was right all along? Beside it, she found a handwritten draft, her father's. Never submitted. The ink slanted like a whisper fighting through silence. Ranger was correct. The system cannot allow right when the wrong one holds power. She bit her lip, holding back tears, not from grief, but fury. Fury for a being who had given his loyalty and instincts and was cast aside like a faulty tool. Fury that someone had rewritten his life with a single line and buried it like it never happened. Then she found it, an old memory card inside an unmarked envelope. Plugged into the computer, a short video loaded. Ranger, wearing his task harness, walking with her father through the schoolyard. No words, just Dylan's eyes on Ranger. That silent, slow nod that said, "You did right, Ranger." The video froze on a single frame. Ranger sitting in the courtyard, watching a student from afar. Unmoving. But those eyes, Lila had seen them before. At the auction, in the shed, in the kitchen, eyes that never forget. Lila turned to Ranger. She didn't know if he understood everything, but his gaze, meeting hers, was steady. Calm. As if to say, "You've seen. Now it's your turn." Lila folded the file, slipped the video into her coat, and stared out the window, where the light had faded. She was no longer the girl who waited for miracles. She was the one who would rise, to return the rightful name to her father's forgotten companion. "I promise," she whispered. "I'll make the world see. Ranger was never wrong. They just never listened." And as night fell over the small home at the edge of Redvale, in the quiet of a countryside once scarred, a vow was etched into time. Not loud, not fierce, but as firm as the small hand that rested on the back of a warrior, long waiting to be called by his true name. The following morning, the sky over Redvale was so clear that even the thinnest threads of cloud stretched across the hilltops could be seen. The town was hosting its annual summer gathering at the Central Park, a space with a small lake, a temporary wooden stage, and rows of chairs placed with casual disarray, mirroring the way people here were still learning to find peace again. Lila wore the floral dress her mother had pressed the night before. Ranger walked beside her, slowly, but without need for guidance. She tied a simple fabric ribbon loosely around his neck, not for control, but as a quiet reminder. They were here, together. From the stage, the PA system echoed familiar announcements. Laughter spread through the crowd as people exchanged fresh-baked pastries. Children ran across the lawn. Soft music played, blending with the smell of apple pie, damp grass, and a summer someone had tried to preserve from a year before. In one corner of the park, a boy named Micah, around 7, messy hair, eyes that always drifted somewhere distant, sat alone. His mother had stepped away briefly for water, leaving him amid the chaotic swirl of sound and movement. Lila stood not far off. She didn't know his name, only saw his hands suddenly clamp over his ears, his body curl inward, shaking in waves. No one else noticed. No one saw what was coming. Except Lila and Ranger. Without a word, Ranger moved, his steps slow, steady, threading through the bustling crowd. No barking, no growling, just a quiet, deliberate motion, as if something inside him had been reawakened, a memory, a lesson etched deeply and now summoned. Ranger approached Micah and lay down between the boy and the crowd. He didn't touch him, didn't push for any response. He simply became a barrier, a living wall to shield against the chaos. Micah trembled, then slowly opened his eyes, his gaze landing on Ranger's back. A small hand extended. Not to pet, just to rest, lightly, on the thick fur, as if testing whether he could feel again. Then came the sob. Not a scream, but a soft, shuddering cry, like a storm breaking against a shore made of gentleness and presence. Adults returned, then more gathered. The park hushed. No one stepped in. They simply watched. Ranger, Micah, and the thread of connection, fragile yet startlingly real. A phone was raised. Then another. No one spoke. No cues were given. But everyone understood. This moment wasn't just for one child, one family, or one dog. It was for Redvale. Minutes passed. Micah calmed, still seated beside Ranger. His hand remained, resting on that back, afraid to let go. Lila walked over, knelt beside them. She asked nothing, said nothing, just placed her hand beside Micah's. And the three of them, a girl, a boy, a dog, sat there, in the midday breeze, in a park that had known grief, in a town relearning how to believe in kindness. When Micah's mother returned, she cried, not out of fear, but because, for the first time in months, her son had reached out to another living being, on his own, without barriers, without fear. And in the middle of that silent circle, Ranger closed his eyes, as if he had just completed a mission. No reward needed, no name in lights, just right place, right time. One adult nearby had captured the moment. The video was less than 2 minutes long, but it showed everything. Ranger leaving Lila's side, approaching Micah, lying between him and the world, and the tiny hand resting gently in fur, silence folding into something almost sacred. It was uploaded to a small Facebook group. No one expected it to leave Redvale, but within hours, it had been shared thousands of times, then tens of thousands, then millions. The first comment was simple. I don't know who this dog is, but I've never seen peace like that. Another read, why is it that the dog we discarded is the only one who could reach my son? And the question echoed deep in many hearts. If Ranger wasn't good enough, then what is our standard? Within 24 hours, local media contacted Micah's mother. She declined interviews, saying, I have nothing to add. Ranger tells the story best. Ranger's name began appearing in headlines. The natural therapy dog. The rejected warrior. Redvale's silent hero. The titles varied, but the central question did not. How could a dog deemed useless become the only being able to calm an autistic child? The next morning, Lila's mailbox overflowed with letters, handwritten from Ohio, Georgia, even Canada. People thanked not her, but Ranger. Some spoke of children who never spoke, others of grief after school shootings. One simply wrote, "Thank you for letting us witness kindness." Mr. Walter received a call from an old military colleague, asking if Ranger's old training files could be reviewed. Lila's mother was invited to 2 national interviews. She declined both. Lila stayed with Ranger, brushing him with her father's old wooden comb. She didn't ask how he felt, didn't speak of the video, because she knew Ranger didn't care about cameras or headlines. Ranger only cared about one thing. Was the boy okay? And maybe, in a world chasing fleeting glory, the simple certainty of a dog who needs only that one answer is what made millions stop and think. But behind that light, something else had begun to stir. 3 days after the video went viral, a thick envelope arrived in Lila's mailbox. No sender, no seal, just a typed notice, enclosed in a sealed plastic pouch. This item is listed under Project Data 7, item code K9-17-R. Immediate retrieval is required to avoid breach of national data safety regulations. No greeting, no recipient name. Only a faded red stamp. Federal Data Recovery Unit. Mrs. Monroe stood silent in the kitchen, gripping the letter until the paper cut into her fingertips. The ink hadn't smeared, but her eyes had. Mr. Walter read it, frowned, and set his coffee down, like someone had reopened a memory he never meant to revisit. That night, as Ranger slept on his blanket beneath Lila's feet, the house grew unnaturally quiet. No bedtime stories, no clinking of dishes, only the wind brushing the window frame, and something else, subtle and shifting. Lila curled into her window seat, holding a journal still untouched. Ranger's breathing was steady, but carried less peace than before. It was the breath of a creature who sensed what he feared most was returning. Not seizures, not pain. The fear of being discarded again. Once, they labeled Ranger unreliable, shelved him inside a program that vanished without reason. Now, just as he was beginning to live again, they wanted to drag him back into silence. Not because Ranger did wrong, but because he did right, in a way no one expected. Mrs. Monroe dialed the number listed in the letter. No one answered. Just an automated message. You have reached the National Security Data Intake Center. All communications are recorded. Please leave a message after the tone. Beep. She paused, then quietly said, His name is Ranger. He's saving children here, every day. If you want to take that away, come speak to my daughter. The next day, no one came, but an anonymous article surfaced on an independent news site. Project D7, Why Won't the Government Release Records on the Canine School Initiative? It wasn't long, it didn't accuse, but it was enough. Military, therapy, and education professionals began asking questions. In the comments, people described similar programs that vanished overnight. Ranger's name moved from the press to closed-door meetings. Some called him a data breach risk. Others called him living proof of what was buried. To Lila, Ranger was neither. Ranger was her friend, and friends don't get returned. That afternoon, the skies over Redvale were still, without wind. Mrs. Monroe was hanging laundry behind the house when the phone rang. The sound echoed at regular intervals, not urgent, not rushed, but unlike any call she'd ever received. An unknown number. No greeting, just a man's voice, dry, precise, and so cold it cut through the air. We represent a federal unit under the Data Archives Division. There is reason to believe that item K9-17-R is currently outside of authorized containment. Mrs. Monroe didn't respond. The voice continued. The item must be retrieved immediately to ensure proper safety protocols. Any delay may result in unintended consequences. Still, she said nothing. Just listened. To the sound of her own heartbeat. Clear. Measured. You mean Ranger? She finally whispered. We are not authorized to confirm unofficial identifiers. The item must be surrendered by 1800 hours tomorrow. The line went dead. No threats, no urgency, but the weight of the call left no doubt this wasn't a request. Mrs. Monroe turned her gaze to the front porch, where Ranger lay basking in the fading light. Lila sat beside him, a book resting in her lap, unread, her eyes tracking the slow, steady rhythm of the dog's breath. Two beings, one learning to trust the world, and one finally being trusted by it. She walked over slowly, careful not to startle them, sat beside her daughter, gently laid a hand on Ranger's back. His fur was warm, his heartbeat steady, but his ears twitched, just enough to say he knew. Another door was about to close behind him. "What's wrong, Mom?" Lila asked softly. Her mother didn't answer right away. She ran her hand along Ranger's spine, then whispered, "They want to take him." The girl didn't ask who. She didn't ask why. She just bent lower, wrapping her arms around Ranger tighter, like if she held on hard enough, the moment might freeze right there. But the world does not stop. That night, Mrs. Monroe wrote a letter, not to send, just to record. Like a message left for the past. They abandoned him once. They don't get to take back what they never protected. The letter stayed in a drawer until morning. At dawn, a black vehicle pulled up at the edge of town. No local plates, no insignia. The driver didn't get out, just sat there, quietly, like a reminder. They were here, and they were waiting. Ranger still lay beneath the porch. Lila beside him, one hand on his collar, whispering something so soft no one else could hear. But Ranger heard. His eyes blinked once, then he shifted, just a little closer to her feet. Not asking to stay, just saying, "If I must go, I'll go, so long as someone walks beside me." But Redvale wasn't letting Ranger go anywhere. The call between Mrs. Monroe and the government never made the papers. No headlines, no evening broadcast. It started with a whisper in the town market, where Mr. Walter stood beside his vegetable stand, staring at the unfamiliar car parked on the outskirts. No state tags, no guessing needed. He gave a slow nod, then turned to another man, a retired firefighter who once pulled dozens of children from the east wing of the school on that silent day when gunfire replaced laughter. A knock that didn't land, a look exchanged, and things began. The next morning, the auto shop hung a sign, closed, keeping a promise to a friend. The elementary school canceled PE so teachers could help students write cards for a brave dog who needs protection. At the cafe near the town square, the morning country music was replaced by audio clips, Ranger's first bark after arriving at Lila's home, and the little girl's trembling voice during her first therapy session. No one shouted, because the whole town remembered. 2 years ago, Redvale was a name people avoided, where victims were counted by classroom hour, and mourning wore the color of blood-stained uniforms. And it was Ranger who broke that silence first. He didn't growl, didn't bark. He simply walked in, sat beside children curled up in therapy rooms, laid his head on the lap of a boy who had lost his sister, or curled behind a student who hadn't spoken since the trauma. Ranger didn't heal pain. He made it bearable. And now, he stood to be taken away, labeled an asset. The mayor of Redvale, a survivor himself, called an emergency town hall, not to argue, to listen. Over 200 came. No banners, no pounding fists, only memories. A young boy brought a crayon drawing, a dog lying in the schoolyard, surrounded by smiling kids. A widowed mother carried a clip of Ranger stopping her panic-stricken son from running into the road. And Mr. Walter, the old soldier, carried a small wooden box. Inside, an audio tape left by Dylan Monroe, Lila's late father. His voice filled the chamber, as if still alive. "If there's one dog on earth built to trust a child more than any adult, it's Ranger." No one spoke after that, because nothing else needed saying. The old wood beams of Redvale's town hall had once echoed with debates about clean water, library budgets, and fallen trees after winter storms. But not today. Today, no agenda was read, no minutes recorded. Only presence, and a community reclaiming its reason to stand together. Mr. Walter stepped to the podium. His hand shook slightly, but his voice stood tall, like the day he addressed his unit years ago. He didn't talk about war or politics. He talked about one October morning when Dylan Monroe left him a sealed envelope. Inside, recordings, training notes, and a wrinkled note that read, "If I'm not here, please tell the story." A man rose to speak. The former elementary school principal, now retired due to hearing loss from the library blast. He revealed that Redvale had quietly tested a pilot school K-9 program. Ranger was the first. No federal funds, no publicity, just one goal: to detect dangerous behavior before it escalated. And Ranger, the so-called failure, had flagged one particular student 3 days before the tragedy. But they didn't listen, because the boy was the son of a powerful senator. And instead of action, they shut the program down, confiscated the data, branded Ranger a system error. Dylan Monroe resigned weeks later. It was all laid out, not in accusation, but in sorrow, as if an entire town had finally admitted its silence. A mother stood. Her son had been in 3rd grade, his class struck by bullets. Ranger was the first being the boy allowed to touch after months of silence. She didn't need proof. She just needed Ranger to stay. Lila sat in the front row, arms wrapped around Ranger. She didn't speak. She watched the adults rise, one by one, not to defend reputation but memory. Scattered puzzle pieces, finally forming a map. Her mother's hand gripped her shoulder, gently but with resolution, no longer torn between reason and instinct. Some things cannot be measured by security risk or protocol. Sometimes, all a community needs is to hold on to the one thing that reminded them they were still human, the ability to believe in a creature once discarded, and call him friend. The meeting ended without a vote. Everyone had already spoken, in their own way, and Ranger, still resting, head on the girl's lap, ears flicking softly, seemed to hear, to understand, to wait for something only hearts that still believe in the right thing could recognize, that the truth had finally been called by its rightful name. The next morning, the sun rose later than usual, or perhaps it only felt that way to Redvale, as sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Town Hall, casting long, warm beams across benches still holding the imprint of those who had sat there hours before. Lila stepped out of the meeting room with Ranger at her side. No leash, no commands. Ranger simply walked, as if he'd always belonged here, part of this land, part of these memories. In her hands was a crayon sketch, rough and faded. It showed a small wooden cabin nestled in the field behind the elementary school, a white picket fence, a blue ribbon holding up a sign, Redvale Healing Center, Ranger's Home. Her mother stepped towards the microphone as if to speak, then stopped. She looked to her daughter, then nodded. At that moment, Lila stepped up to the podium. Before her sat the very adults who had once feared, once doubted, but now sat in silence, as though waiting to hear something they'd forgotten long ago. Her voice rang out, not loud, not perfectly clear, but just enough to fill the quiet between each row with something warmer than morning light. "I won't keep Ranger just for myself," she said, her eyes resting on the former principal, the grocer's wife, and those who once picked up bullet casings from the schoolyard 3 years ago. "I want to build a place where people can come, sit with Ranger, and start believing in something again." No one clapped, no one laughed. But from the corner of the room, an elderly man, a retired librarian, pulled out a folded bill from his coat pocket and placed it on the table. "For the first brick," he whispered, then another, and another. No slogans, no campaigns, just people who had lost something, now reaching for a chance to build again. That evening, the small wooden house behind the school was cleaned out. The scent of sawdust, fresh paint, and foil-wrapped cookies filled the path to the door. Lila didn't sleep. She sat beside Ranger, one hand resting on his back, as though passing something silent between them. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "someone's going to come. Sit here. Cry about something they can't put into words. You'll be there, right?" Ranger didn't move, just breathed, slow, steady, as if making a promise. No recordings, no contracts, just trust, and the right to stay. During the first week after the center opened, few people came. Some parents peeked through the window, then quietly left. Others lingered at the door but didn't step inside. They were used to closed offices, sterile diagnoses, and advice that couldn't mend a child's fractured heart. Until Natalie came in. 11 years old, frizzy brown hair, and haunted eyes that had watched her older brother fall in a classroom. She didn't speak. She simply sat on the rug in the center of the room, opened a sketchbook, and placed a pencil beside her. Ranger rose from the corner. No signal. No prompt. He walked over and lay beside her, not touching, not intruding, just near enough for Natalie to know. Someone was here. 10 minutes passed before the pencil began to move. Slowly, tentatively, but real. At the end of the session, Natalie placed the drawing on the desk. A house with a white fence. A dog sitting on the porch. Beneath it, she had scrawled in shaky print, "A place where I don't have to be afraid to sleep anymore." The next day, Luca arrived. A boy who once collapsed in panic at the sound of an ambulance siren. Ranger was lying by the window. Luca circled the room, eyes glued to the floor, arms wrapped tight around his backpack. His mother sat near the door, trembling, tears barely held back. As Luca passed Ranger, the dog lifted his head, not barking, not moving, just looking. No one could explain what happened in that moment. But Luca stopped. Didn't run. Didn't scream. He sat down and said 3 words, his first in months. "This dog understands." The room froze. 1 week later, 4 more children came. Kids who used to flinch at a touch. Kids known by case numbers, labeled severely withdrawn, unresponsive, treatment-resistant. With Ranger, they didn't need to respond. They didn't need to talk. They just needed to breathe. And Ranger knew who needed to be approached and who simply needed quiet companionship. Each session was documented. Staff tracked behaviors, moods, reactions, before, during, and after time with Ranger. The data wasn't poetic. Just small things. A glance that lingered, a hand that stopped shaking, a first sentence after months of silence, a night's sleep without nightmares. And nestled among those clinical reports, dozens of crayon drawings, purple ink letters with misspelled words, and stammered recordings that contained what the world had long forgotten. Faith, not in medicine, not in professionals, but in a dog who had once been discarded, once auctioned off for scraps, once marked for death. Now, Ranger was the anchor for souls that had no words for their pain, and each breath he took was a heartbeat returned to those who had once believed they'd lost their way. But then something unexpected happened. It wasn't just children anymore. One quiet weekend, Mrs. Gibson, who had survived the library shooting, brought cookies and a worn book. She said nothing, just sat on the bench by the window where Ranger lay, and began to read. Not for anyone to hear, as if reading to herself, for the first time in years. Another time, Mr. Howard, the old carpenter who hadn't left his house since losing his grandson, walked in. His hands shook as he placed a hand-carved sign on the table. "Welcome to Red Veil Healing Center, where silence learns to speak." He didn't stay, but returned the next morning with his tools and a broken chair he offered to fix. Then came a third person, then a fourth. Someone brought dried lavender. Someone left behind an old guitar. Someone simply touched Ranger's head, like releasing a wordless prayer they'd carried too long. And Red Veil, the name once spoken with sorrow, began to change. No parades, no celebration. Just quieter afternoons, mornings that began with soft greetings, nods turned into voices. In the hallway, Lila and her mother began pinning up tiny handwritten notes from townsfolk. Short, unpretentious. One read, "I laughed today, for the first time in 19 months. Another said, "My daughter slept through the night." No sleepwalking. Thank you, Ranger. and beneath each line, the shaky handwriting of someone who once believed they couldn't begin again. And Ranger, still there, gentle, still, but at the center of a widening circle, reaching out to gather the pieces of a community once broken. Not with speeches, not with treatment plans, but with presence. The presence of a creature who never asked for anything, only to be trusted and called by the right name. A name nearly erased from a government ledger, now whispered again, spoken aloud, returned like a living prayer. Ranger. And in the way Redvale began to breathe again, slow, deep, and full of silence, people started to believe that it is never too late to begin again, so long as someone is there, willing to wait. But not everyone came to wait, and not everything that arrived came to heal. The first week after the third clip of Ranger went viral, a television crew from Louisville drove into Redvale. They arrived in a sleek black SUV, reporters in tailored suits, dark sunglasses, holding microphones stamped with the logo of the state's top news channel. The cameraman counted each frame. The scene coordinator asked Lila to take a step back, adjust her collar, and requested, "Could the dog sit a little closer? We need a better shot." Lila didn't resist. Ranger didn't react. But something shifted. A breath lost. A silence broken. The interview aired Friday night. The headline scrolled in white over a red background. The girl from Redvale, healing a community or just herself? The anchor's voice, steady and clinical, analyzed Lila's facial expressions like she was a reality TV character. A clip was played repeatedly, focusing on her saying, "I just want people to see Ranger." But the rest of her words, about hope, about life, about why she never kept Ranger for herself, were cut. All that remained was the image of a little girl next to a dog. Her smile stretched unnaturally long through transition effects. The next day, 3 anonymous messages were sent to the center's email. One read, "That girl's putting on a show." Another said, "Someone should investigate the home situation. Why is a child running a therapy program?" The third was colder still. Fake compassion. Lila's mother read them, then deleted them immediately. But her face couldn't hide the unease. Mr. Walter said nothing. He brought over an old radio and turned on soft jazz. "Music's the only thing they can't edit," he muttered. But Lila, though she said nothing, heard the scratches on the inside. That day's session, she stayed quiet. She sat behind the wooden door, scribbling nonsense on the corner of a desk. Ranger still came. Still lay beside the boy, struggling with auditory panic. Still eased his head into a small, open palm. Still patient. Still gentle. But Lila knew. He felt it too. Because for the first time since coming home, Ranger didn't eat his dinner, not from pain, but because he understood people could doubt anything, even kindness. And that kind of doubt, that was what made a creature, once stripped of all hope, falter again. Lila held Ranger in the dark. She said nothing. Her fingers gently touched the patch of fur behind his neck, the one that had once been shaved for injections. It had grown back, uneven, a bit coarse. But still, it was new. And something inside her stirred, not anger, but a question she'd never dared ask. "Has anyone ever truly listened? From beginning to end?" Ranger didn't answer, but he breathed. This time, deep and heavy, as if he'd swallowed the grief she couldn't. 2 days later, a national broadcast team arrived to film a special feature on the healing power of a forgotten dog. They flooded the therapy room with LED lights, white and glaring, erasing the soft ambiance it had always known. Reporters hovered with iPads, following scripts. Cameras loomed larger than anything Ranger had seen. And the clicking began. That kind of clicking a creature once wounded could recognize. This was not a safe place. Ranger lay beside Lila, as usual, but his tail didn't move, his eyes didn't blink, his ears didn't shift. The cameraman crouched, stepped back, and gestured. "Can we move the dog a bit closer to the girl?" No one objected. But Ranger began to tremble. Lila noticed. Her hands clenched. "Ranger, it's okay. I'm here." Her voice was soft, too soft to drown out the production assistant yelling over the radio. "Camera 3, zoom in on the girl's eyes." Ranger let out a sudden, sharp breath. Not normal breathing, a stuttered, strained exhale, chest convulsing. His legs stiffened, eyes blurred, then rolled. Lila dropped to her knees. "No, no, no, Ranger, look at me, I'm here. Anchor, Ranger, anchor!" But the seizure struck, like an undertow, silent, violent, unforgiving. The room froze. The host stared, stunned. The cameras kept rolling. A producer whispered, "Cut that, don't let it air." But no one stopped. Because outside, someone was live streaming. Viewership numbers climbed, thousands by the minute. 3 minutes later, Ranger lay motionless. Not the motionless of surrender, but the aftermath of a war waged in silence. Lila never left his side. Her hand on his chest, feeling the faintest tremble. A nurse approached gently. The cameras backed away. But it was too late. By 9 p.m., the video was clipped, edited, and uploaded to multiple platforms. The headline, "Discarded dog has seizure on live broadcast, fit for therapy." The first comment, "Why let that girl take it around vulnerable kids?" The second, "If it's that unstable, the government should intervene for public safety." The next day, Lila's mother received a call. No caller ID, no name. The voice said, "We need to assess the current custodial conditions for item K9 Epsilon 12. Please prepare for transfer this week." She asked, "Do you mean Ranger?" Silence. Then, "Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be." When she hung up, Lila was already behind her. Quiet. No tears, no shouting. Just the undeniable truth settling in. That the world had returned to its default setting, where kindness had to fight to survive. And in the quiet room, Ranger still lay there. No food, no sleep, but eyes open. And in those eyes, one question burned. Who will stand up this time? The answer didn't come from Lila. She lay in her room, cocooned in blankets, not eating, not speaking, not looking at anyone. The broadcast replayed every hour. Each time it aired, her mother rushed to mute the screen. But the weight of the comments seeped through even the thickest walls. She's using the dog for attention. Kids shouldn't make security decisions. Ranger should be placed in expert hands. Each word, a silent needle through the fragile trust Lila had stitched together. Not with logic, but belief. Ranger was taken to the vet the next morning in a white pickup truck. No plates. Lila didn't say goodbye. She didn't step outside. She just rested her hand on the foggy window pane and whispered something no one else could hear. Maybe it was an apology. Maybe a promise. Or maybe just a quiet name meant for someone lying only a few streets away, still waiting to hear it spoken. Mr. Walter stood on the porch as the truck drove off, his face set, not with rage, but with helplessness. He knew Ranger should not have been moved after the seizure, and he knew. Those who came weren't there for the dog. They came for something colder, something buried. The community started to fracture. Some said Ranger should be surrendered for safety. Others stood at the Monroe fence and whispered, "If Ranger hadn't been there that day, my son would have never touched another person again." The story began to split. The more famous it became, the more it tore. And Lila, at the center, small, thin, and for the first time since it all began, broken, not from exhaustion, but from the quietest question of all. What if I was wrong? The door creaked open. Her mother entered. No tray, no medicine, only a single object placed gently on the bedside table, her father's old notebook. And one sentence, whispered from a place deeper than pain. "You don't need anyone to understand you, but Ranger does. And if there's one being on this earth worth standing up for, it's him." Then she left. Didn't look back. Lila said nothing, only stared at the blurred ink on the first page. Faith is not born from strength. It is what remains when all strength is gone. The room fell still. But elsewhere, at the veterinary center, Ranger was dreaming. A dream without voices, just the sound of small footsteps running toward him, and a name, cutting through the fog like morning light. "Anchor! Ranger! Anchor!" And perhaps it was that call, or something stronger than any medication, that stirred beneath Ranger's eyelids. A flicker, a twitch of the ear, barely enough for a doctor to notice, but more than enough for a child once saved by him to feel deep within their heart. Because at that very moment, in Redvale, in a small wooden cabin among the pines that once served as the town's first therapy space, a boy was drawing. He drew a dog standing between a crowd and a child who smiled for the first time in months. In another town, a little girl once paralyzed by social fear was writing a letter. Her handwriting was shaky, uneven, but at the bottom she tried her hardest to spell out 3 words. Bring Ranger home. The drawings, the voice messages, the handwritten notes. They didn't come from adults. They didn't come from any organization. They came from forgotten hearts, now rising to protect the very creature who had once stayed for them, when no one else would. Online, the #sign Anchor for Us began to spread. Short videos, soft-spoken confessions, the steady, cloudy eyes of Ranger, each one stitched together into a movement no algorithm could predict, because it wasn't born of anger or defiance, it was born of gratitude. One child, eyes cast down, whispered to the camera, "He can't talk, but he understands me." Another boy, face hidden under a wool beanie, simply held up a paper. On it, a single line connecting 2 circles. One was a heart. The other was a dog. No scripts, no leaders. And yet, somehow, hundreds, then thousands of messages, drawings, recordings began to pour in. All addressed to one place, the veterinary clinic on the outskirts of Redvale, where Ranger lay still, as if the world had already stopped needing him. And the next morning, when the attending doctor walked in, the first thing he saw wasn't the monitor. It was a wall covered in drawings. Someone had plastered them overnight. Hearts, bridges, a dog standing guard at a hospital bed, with the patient being himself. The doctor didn't ask who did it, because he understood. These didn't come from someone. They came from every Ranger had ever held together. At that very moment, the front door creaked open. A familiar figure stepped inside. Limping slightly, faded baseball cap, a weathered jacket with a creased left sleeve, signs of a man who had served longer than most people had lived. Mr. Walter said nothing. He placed a thick file at the reception desk, wrapped in transparent plastic. On top, a handwritten label, ink blurred with age. Original documentation, School K-9 program, early intervention behavior training. The nurse opened the first few pages and froze. Everything was there: training outlines, behavior assessments, protocol codes, including anchor protocol and pre-seizure warning indicators. And a name, printed boldly at the top: Dylan Monroe. No announcements were made. But within hours, Mr. Walter's car was parked in front of Red Vale's town hall. That afternoon, in an emergency session unlike any the town had seen, Mr. Walter stood before the entire council. Beside him stood a retired nurse who had worked with PTSD patients, a high school teacher who'd once watched Ranger de-escalate a seizure in class, a former Marine who had nearly taken his own life, had it not been for Ranger laying beside him for 3 silent hours, reminding him he was still breathing. They didn't give speeches. They simply signed their names on a petition. We demand the restoration and protection of the school Canine therapy program, with Ranger as its living proof. No press, no flashing cameras. But the people came, filling the lawn outside. In their hands were handmade signs, markers, chalk, shaking pen strokes on cardboard. We will not abandon Ranger. Anchor is still here. Red Vale remembers. And in all the noise, a sacred silence formed. When Mr. Walter stepped outside, he didn't speak. He pulled from his coat an old leash, military grade, the kind Dylan once used. He handed it to Lila, her hands still trembling from sleepless nights, and said, "This belongs to someone who's earned it." Lila took it, bowed her head. She didn't cry, but her small, fragile hands gripped it tight. Because now, she wasn't alone. And Ranger, though his eyes had yet to open, must have known it too. Because his breathing began to steady again. That evening, in the small kitchen that had once held both hope and despair, Mrs. Monroe placed a cup of warm chamomile tea before her daughter. The scent drifted softly, like time exhaling through steam. She didn't speak at first, just watched Ranger lying in the corner, not yet healed, but his ears twitching again at the sound of a door opening. Her gaze fell to the old leash, now in Lila's lap. Not just an artifact from her husband's past, but a responsibility her 10-year-old daughter had chosen to carry. "You want to fight?" her mother asked, her voice soft, not scolding, not warning. Lila nodded. No hesitation. "Then fight," she said. "Where your voice will matter." The girl looked up, puzzled. "Washington," her mother continued, eyes still on Ranger. "Congress." The air stilled. Even the ticking clock seemed to slow. Lila had never imagined leaving Red Vale, never imagined sitting before a hearing, facing the very people who once labeled Ranger an item for secure retrieval. But now, hearing those words, she didn't feel fear. She felt something sharper, clearer, responsibility, as if this was the one thing she could still do, to protect the one good thing her father left behind. That night, when the town slept, Mrs. Monroe stood by the window, staring down the dirt road that led out of Red Vale. Her hand rested on Dylan's old journal, pages still smudged with sweat and dust from the field. She opened to the last page, where his handwriting had faded. Dogs aren't trained to become symbols, but sometimes their loyalty teaches humans how to live right. She closed her eyes. And the next morning, as sunlight spilled over the roof of their wooden home, Lila stepped out the door with a small backpack. Inside, her sketchbook, letters from children, and Ranger's leash wrapped in her mother's scarf. The bus to the Capitol only came once a day. But that day, as the wheels turned, Lila didn't look back, because everything she loved would always remain behind her. But the one truth that needed light lay ahead. And Ranger, though he couldn't ride beside her, was still there. In his steady breath, in a promise beyond words, in the heartbeat of a warrior finally called by his rightful name. The journey from Red Vale to Washington wasn't long, not in miles, but in depth, because it carried things no one expected a 10-year-old to bear. An unfinished dream from a father now gone. A leash belonging to a dog once erased from a federal training registry. And a heart wide enough to hold the pieces grown-ups had let slip through their fingers. Lila sat near the back row of the vehicle, a small backpack clutched tightly to her chest. Inside, a cardboard model, the first draft of the Red Vale Community Healing Center. Blueprint sketches, photos from therapy sessions, a clip of Ranger lying beside an autistic child as he laughed for the first time. And handwritten letters, shaky with innocence, from children who once believed they didn't deserve to be loved. Beside her, her mother sat silent, eyes never leaving the window. Mrs. Monroe wasn't one for many words, but her hand never left Lila's, not from fear, but to remind her, whatever lies ahead, she won't face it alone. Ranger lay curled beneath Lila's feet, his old tag still around his neck, faint lettering engraved, Canine, seizure class. Every time the car curved, his body shifted slightly, but his ears stayed alert, watchful, as if that protective instinct had never skipped a beat. Mr. Walter sat in the front passenger seat, holding a thick folder, every document he had gathered over the past weeks. Buried reports, eyewitness statements, Ranger's original training records, and one final recording from Dylan Monroe, a voice that once dreamed of a world where dogs weren't just trained to guard, but to listen. To children no one else would. The Capitol gates came into view, immense, reflective, layered in glass, but none of them flinched. When Lila stepped out, Ranger rose beside her, needing no command, his steps slow but steady, his eyes forward, unshaken. Inside, the hallway to the hearing room stretched long and hushed. Their footsteps echoed like distant drums, heralding the moment something long forgotten was about to be remembered. No one said much, because they all knew. This wasn't just about keeping a dog. It was about keeping faith that a being once cast aside could be the very place where kindness begins again. And as they crossed the threshold, facing the room of power and law, Lila didn't look up. She looked sideways, toward Ranger. And Ranger blinked. Once. Slow. Even. As if to say, go on. Every right thing begins with a small step. The microphone was lowered as far as it could go, just enough for a 10-year-old girl. Before her, rows of congressional members. Behind them, journalists, aides, strangers, many there more out of curiosity than compassion. But Lila didn't flinch. She unzipped her backpack, pulled out a photo. In it, a younger version of herself, cradled in her father's arms. Between them, a thin, alert dog, ears perked, eyes waiting, as if listening for the name it hadn't yet been given. She placed the photo on the table, then raised her chin. My name is Lila Monroe. I'm not here to talk about a dog. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, because the room fell silent. I'm here to talk about a friend, a soldier, a piece of memory the grown-ups left behind because they thought it didn't matter anymore. She spoke of the auction in Red Vale, the old coffee tin she used to buy Ranger, with the exact amount her father had once saved to take her to her first concert. The tiny kitchen where the dog didn't eat or bark for 10 days until he heard 2 words. Anchor, Ranger. She spoke of the children he had helped. Micah, the boy who couldn't touch anyone until he felt that gentle weight around his neck. Of the letters scrawled in shaky print, still managing to say, I'm not afraid anymore, because of Ranger. She didn't read from a script. She didn't need to, because every word came from where it had always been kept, right where Ranger lay each night, at the foot of her bed, guarding wounds she hadn't yet learned to name. "I don't know much about law," Lila said, her voice trembling only slightly. "And I don't understand why a dog that was thrown away can be demanded back like some object." She paused, but her gaze stayed fixed. "But I know there are things grown-ups forget, because they're busy, because they're scared, because they've given up." Her hand moved gently to Ranger's tag, the letters nearly worn away. K9, seizure class. But Ranger never forgot anyone. Then she bowed her head. No applause. No grand reactions. Only something small, something soft. In the front row, one hand pressed slowly over a chest, where something had once been lost. And at the back of the room, a man once labeled emotionally indifferent blinked as something wet slipped down his cheek. Just then, at the foot of the speaker's table, Ranger lifted his head. No bark, no growl, just a steady gaze, straight toward the very people who once sought to take him away. There was no plea in his eyes, only a reminder that sometimes a dog keeps his promise better than anyone who's ever sworn an oath in that chamber. The room shifted, as if someone had turned down the volume on the world. No keystrokes, no page flips. Even the cameras quietly slid to a wide angle, capturing the girl and her dog. Not a dramatic shot, but the right one. The committee chair stood. An older man with neatly combed silver hair and a faint scar across his left wrist, unnoticed by most. He looked at Ranger a long time. "So long," a few whispered. But then, with a simple nod, he signed the top of the newest bill. Pilot Program, Community K9 Therapy, modeled after Red Veil. The gavel struck. Short, clear. A young congressman rose, hand raised. No microphone, no speech. Only a voice lifted by gratitude. "I'd like to propose we award Ranger the Civil Honor Medal for service beyond duty, beyond title, and beyond bias." No one objected. And then, one by one, uncoordinated, unrehearsed, people stood. From camera crew to Capitol guards, from lawmakers to assistants clutching their phones, they stood. Because some thank yous cannot be spoken. Lila looked up. She didn't smile, but her hand rested gently on Ranger's back, where bones had once protruded, and now rose only with the rhythm of breath. He didn't move. But when the applause rose, long, thunderous, alive, his ears twitched, as if he was listening, not to understand, but to remember that every step taken by a dog once discarded can still reach the heart of a nation. Because truth, no matter how long buried, will one day be called by its rightful name. And justice doesn't always arrive in argument. Sometimes it comes in a gaze, a breath, and the quiet presence of a soul who never gave up. That afternoon, autumn light filtered softly through the maple tree in front of the Red Veil Community Healing Center. The golden glow settled gently, unhurried, as if time itself wanted to slow down, just long enough to hold a moment someone might need a lifetime to remember. Lila sat beneath the familiar tree, on the same patch of earth that had once held Ranger's first paw prints when he returned from the veterinary center. She didn't speak, didn't draw, didn't write. She simply breathed, steadily, calmly, her gaze fixed on the children playing near the therapy rings, their steps lighter, freer, thanks to something they didn't yet have words to name. Ranger rested his head on her lap, quiet, soft, and utterly present. His back rose and fell with the wind that passed through the hills. No more seizures, no sudden collapses, only a steady, grounded peace, the kind that made anyone sitting next to him feel safe. A ball rolled over. A little girl with messy hair picked it up, then paused when she saw Ranger. She didn't run off, didn't call out. She simply sat beside him and placed a hand gently on his back. Ranger didn't turn his head, but his ears twitched, as if he understood the unspoken message. Lila smiled, a smile that asked for nothing, because she knew. This quiet, gentle afternoon was exactly what her father had once dreamed of. A place where children are heard, where wounds don't have to scream to be healed, where both humans and dogs have the right to begin again. The end-of-season breeze carried the scent of dry grass and damp earth. A leaf landed softly on Ranger's back. He didn't flinch, didn't stir. He just breathed in deeper, like he wanted to hold it all. A therapist stepped outside, saw the two old friends beneath the tree, and nodded quietly. He didn't interrupt, because even adults, sometimes, learn to respect sacred moments shared by two beings who had once crossed the boundary of life, death, and lost faith. And as with every evening, the sun began to slip behind the hills. But today, that light wasn't just light. It was a final, warm touch before the world turned to a new season, a place where what is right has finally been called by its rightful name. Inside the small office at the back of the center, Lila sat by the window, holding the old leather journal her father had once used to jot down ideas for the school K-9 program. The pages had yellowed, some ink smudged, but remained intact, just as they were when she first opened it. On the first page, her father's writing was still clear. Not every dog needs to be a hero, but give them a chance, and they'll save the world in their own way. Lila flipped through the pages, stopping at one she had saved, a space just for thoughts she shared only with Ranger. Her pen moved across the paper without pause or correction. The words appeared, simple but steady. Ranger doesn't need to save the world. He just needs to be there, at the right time, in the right place. Outside the window, the laughter of children echoed across the grass. A young boy chased after another therapy dog, his footsteps, his calls, his heartbeat filling the twilight air as though Redvale had never been a place burdened by grief. Lila closed the journal, her hand resting on the cover like a quiet thank you. She didn't need to write anything more. Because behind her, Ranger had entered, settled beside her chair, and rested his head gently on her feet. No bark, no movement, just eyes closed and breath slow and calm. And in that silence, Lila understood. She was not alone in this journey of healing. Ranger had never been a miracle, never a myth. He was reality, a companion, a quiet force behind all that is good. And that was enough. The scent of grass and old paper drifted through the room as Lila stood and walked onto the porch. She looked back at Ranger and nodded. Not a command, a signal, a silent pact between two souls who once lost their way and found each other again in this quiet corner of the world. And Ranger, though he didn't open his eyes, tapped his tail against the floor. Once, softly, as if he had read those words in her journal, as if he had waited his whole life to hear exactly that. Beyond the hills, the sun dipped toward the edge of the day, but the light didn't fade. It flared again, one last time, across the red-tiled roof of the healing center, through the open window where hand-drawn pictures fluttered in the breeze. One drawing showed Ranger, standing still at the center of a circle of small hands. No leash, no commands, just trust. Trust that he would not leave, no matter how many times the world tried to turn its back. And from Redvale, Lila's story traveled far. Not through slogans or campaigns, but through the image of a 10-year-old girl holding a coffee tin at an auction, believing that even a dog once rejected deserved to stay. The news reached local papers, then national screens. But more importantly, it changed something quiet in the eyes of those passing through animal shelters, broken training centers, and forgotten neighborhoods. In Colorado, a withdrawn boy was paired with a dog left behind at a bus stop. In Maine, a veterans center launched a pilot dog therapy program. In Texas, a grieving mother adopted a dog once labeled unsuitable. None of it was loud, none of it perfect. But all of it began with something small. A look, a hand reaching out, a patience long enough to see that sometimes what appears broken holds the last unshaken good in the world. And in Redvale, where Ranger lay beside Lila under the final leaves of autumn, no one spoke of awards. No one remembered the phrase data retrieval order that once divided the town. Because everything had already been rewritten, not with verdicts, but with quiet evenings, steady breaths, a dog that never walked away, and a girl who still believed that if someone is listened to long enough, they will never again be called useless. This story doesn't end here, because it never was an ending. It was a beginning of a world learning to pause long enough to love at the right time, in the right place. The way a dog named Ranger once did, and still does, for anyone brave enough to believe that even the smallest things can save an entire heart. Thank you for listening to Ranger's story, a German shepherd once deemed unfit, who became the quiet anchor for an entire community. Maybe the true miracle wasn't who Ranger saved, but the fact that someone believed in him at the right time, in the right place, when all he had left was a heart that never gave up. We often forget, dogs like Ranger don't need pity or titles. They need to be seen as a worthy part of this world. And if you carry anything with you from this story, let it be this. Believe in second chances, that sometimes a discarded dog can rescue a lost soul, that loyalty, empathy, and unconditional love still exist, quiet but powerful, right beneath our feet. Live a little kinder. Look again into the eyes you once overlooked. Who knows? You might just find a Ranger, waiting to be called by his real name.